I hope this stool doesn't mess up the camera a whole lot. Who's Melchizedek? You know, I've been preaching a lot of years, and really I've not thought that much about it. I just have had in the past some assumptions of who Melchizedek is, and some of those assumptions were wrong. You know, he's mentioned once in Genesis, he's mentioned in the book of Psalms, and then that's it, one time. There's two mentions of Melchizedek in the Old Testament. Then all of a sudden you go to the book of Hebrews, and he is one of the major topics when Jesus is discussed as being our high priest. And so what I want to do tonight is basically tie all that together and to try to answer the question, well, who is this Melchizedek? There's been a lot of things that's been kind of misunderstood about this man, and we're going to try to answer some of those questions that we might have. First of all, he's introduced in Genesis chapter 14, 18 through 20. This is the first time, and basically the last time he's mentioned in the book of Genesis. When Melchizedek, king of Salem, and the word Salem means peace, and by the way, Jerusalem, interestingly enough, was also called Salem. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of God Most High. Now this is during the patriarchal dispensation, so at this time there was no Levitical priesthood. And yet he is considered to be the priest of God Most High. Verse 19. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And he blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and he gave him a tithe of all. Now, Abraham had just come from the battle of the kings. He had just defeated all of these nations of kings. He had rescued his nephew, Lot, and had brought him safely out, and they're headed back home when he crosses the path of this man who was the most high priest of God and also the king of Salem. And as the high priest of God blesses Abraham then in turn pays him tithes. Okay, now right now that probably is not very, doesn't sound too significant until you get to the book of Hebrews, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Now, first of all, we find out in this context that he was both priest and king. Notice what it says, that he was the king of Salem, Melchizedek, king of Salem, and he was the most high priest of God. Now, what's the significance of that? We'll find out in the book of Hebrews in a few minutes. Now, the second place that Melchizedek is mentioned is in Psalm 110 and verse 4. And this is the last place in the book in the Old Testament, Psalms 110 verse 4. The Lord has sworn an oath and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And then this very prophecy is quoted in Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 6. The direct quote from this passage. Now, the passage that we're going to be looking at mostly tonight takes place in Hebrews, the 7th chapter, verses 1 through 3. Hebrews 7, 1 through 3. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated the king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Here is where a lot of misunderstanding takes place. So we'll be looking at that in tonight's lesson. Okay, who is Melchizedek? Well, there is individuals who believe that Melchizedek was actually the pre-incarnate Son of God, Jesus Christ. Now, there's no doubt that Jesus did appear in the Old Testament in different places. In the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, when the angel of the Lord appeared in the burning bush, you remember that? Do you remember how the bush basically described himself? He said, "I am God." Now, he had just been called the angel of the Lord. But now this angel of the Lord says, "I am God, and take off your shoes, for where you stand is holy ground." Now, no angel would ever allow a man to worship him because they were created beings. Only the pre-incarnate Christ allowed others to worship him. And then we go to the book of Joshua in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. "And it came to pass that when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite to him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, 'Are you for us or against us?'" Well, that's what he said was, "Are you for us or an adversary?" So he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have come now." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. He also, just as Moses has met the pre-incarnate Son of God. Is Melchizedek the pre-incarnate Son of God? No, they are not. He did not. They are not the same person. In fact, in Hebrews 7 and verse 11 that we read a moment ago, it says there he is another high priest. That means he's not the same person. There's two different priests being discussed in Hebrews 7. Jesus was another of the same order of Melchizedek. So this isn't who he is. Well, then we still have the question, well, who is he? Well, we have the fact that he is a high priest of God under a special calling of God. Now, notice in Hebrews 5 verse 6 that Jesus Christ is in the priesthood order of Melchizedek. The word order means arrangement. It means of the same nature. In other words, he was a priest just like Melchizedek. So basically, when you understand what the writer is talking about pertaining to Jesus Christ, you can understand what he's talking about when he's talking about Melchizedek, as you'll see. And we'll look at the comparison and contrast in just a few moments. The priesthood of Christ would be in the same nature of that of Melchizedek. Now, if you turn back to Matthew 22, verses 43 through 45, go ahead and turn back there if you would. Jesus uses this passage in reference to himself. Verse 43, "And he said to them, How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" Now, this passage that Jesus quotes that signifies himself as being the Lord of David is the same context The very same context where you find that he's the order of Melchizedek. So we know now that in Psalm 110, that context is dealing with the person of Christ. And it's a prophecy about Christ. Now, let's look at Hebrews 7 and verse 3. Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 3. He's without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. I want you to look at this. Made like the Son of God. You notice what it doesn't say? And the Son of God was made like Melchizedek. That is extremely significant. He was created in the same fashion of the Son of God, in the priestly fashion. Now, understand, that's what this is all about. The priesthood of Christ compared to that priesthood of Melchizedek. He is a type of Christ. In the Old Testament, you know what a type is. He is like a shadow or an image of the priesthood of Christ. It is a prophetic preview of the reign of Christ as both prophet and king, because such was, I should say priest and king, for such was Melchizedek. Now, here's the question. We just read Hebrews 7:3. Does that mean that he was eternal in nature, that Melchizedek was eternal in nature? He's in the similitude of Christ. Okay, let's look back at Christ. Well, Christ, according to John, the first chapter, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same was in the beginning with God. Showing Christ to be eternal. Is Melchizedek eternal? Again, in chapter 3, or verse 3 of chapter 7, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Does that sound like he also is eternal? Well, now let's think about this. When Jesus became flesh, he became human, didn't he? And he had parents, didn't he? He also had a beginning and he had an end. In the flesh, you're going to have a beginning and end. So the question is Melchizedek flesh? The answer to that is yes, he was. Now, where we get into trouble is we want to interpret this literal. Again, this is a comparison of the priesthood. Not only the priesthood of Christ, but also the priesthood of the Levites. In this chapter 7, he is contrasting the priesthood of Christ with that of the Aaronic priesthood. And he's using him as an illustration. Now, let's kind of look at this a little bit further. We're going to look at the contrast. First of all, he's talking about where he has no father, no mother, no beginning. It's not about his lineage. As far as Melchizedek's priesthood was concerned, it was not about the lineage. The Levitical priesthood was about lineage, wasn't it? You had to be of the tribe of Levite, correct? You could not be a priest. You could not serve a priest if you was from another tribe. Well, okay, we got a problem. Melchizedek predated the Levitical priesthood. He in fact, predated Levi himself, going all the way back to the father of the Jews, which was Abraham. So the priesthood that he served was by divine appointment of God. It wasn't because of his family lineage. It wasn't because of who he was. It was by divine appointment. Now, the Aaronic priesthood was a result of being a part of the family line. Look at chapter 7, verses 11 through 13. Now, and I want you to pay attention. I've missed this for a long time. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek, and not be called according to the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, of necessity there's also a change of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no man has officiated at the altar. Okay? We understand that. According to the law of Moses, no man except from the tribe of Levi and that family could serve at the altar. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. Therefore, legally, by the Mosaical system, he could not serve as a priest, much less a high priest. Now, we understand that Jesus is not a high priest in the order of the Aaronic priesthood. That's what the writer's trying to tell us. Because his family background had nothing to do with his priesthood. The law specified who could and who could not serve as priests. Because there was a change in the priesthood, there had to be a change in the law. So now the law that once prescribed the children of the Levite tribe to serve as priests has been changed. They served between the ages of 25 through 50, Numbers 8, 24 through 50. Notice what it says about Melchizedek. He served as high priest continually. The priesthood of Aaron, of the Levites, they served temporarily. They had basically a 25-year period where they served as priests before they had to step down. Christ also serves continually. He is not in the order of the Aaronic priesthood. He is in the order by nature of the priesthood of Melchizedek. Melchizedek had no, we're talking about no beginning and no end. He's talking about his role as the high priest. That it had no limitations as far as time restraints. Melchizedek's priesthood was not because of lineage, not according to the law, but he was called by God. It was by divine appointment. Look at chapter 5 and verse 10. Chapter 5, verse 10. As he also says in another place, you are priests forever in the order of Melchizedek, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. Though he was son, yet he learned obedience by the things he suffered. Once again, you see this comparison of Christ and Melchizedek. He is in the nature, the similitude, and he also had no term limit, like the Aaronic priesthood. Now, let's do a comparison of the priesthood of Christ, the priesthood of Melchizedek. That's what this is all about. We've already said, since Jesus was of the tribe of Judah, he could not serve as the priest of the Levites. So therefore, there had to be a change of the law and a change of the priesthood. Now, it is far more evident for that after the similitude of Melchizedek, there arises another priest. Now, already we've seen 2 or 3 times where the word another is used, showing that Jesus is not or was not Melchizedek. He is a priest along the same nature as Melchizedek. Both became high priests by divine appointment. This wasn't by appointment of man. This was of the greatest appointment. He was appointed by God. He was the chosen of God, the anointed of God. This he did not enjoy because of his inheritance, because he was of the tribe of Levi, neither by law. It was by divine appointment. They both served continually. Hebrews 7 and verse 3. Now, what about the significance of the tithes that Abraham paid to Melchizedek? The author in Hebrews 7 makes a big deal about that. Okay, now, let's again kind of review what we've talked about. Just because that the writer uses this phraseology about no beginning, no end, no father, no mother, no genealogy, again, that's not to be taken literal. It's talking about the fact that that wasn't important to his serving as the high priest, that his high priesthood was a divine appointment of God. Now enter Abraham. Abraham, as I mentioned, had already rescued Lot and was returning home, and here the king of Salem, the high priest appointed by God, comes to him, brings him some provisions, and then he blesses Abraham. Abraham in turn pays tithes to him. Now, think about this. In verse 5, the people paid tithes to the Levites, according to the author of Hebrews 7. The people, the Hebrew, they paid the tithes to the Levites. That was part of their responsibility. And the author brings that out. The sons of Levi get these tithes, and of course this supports their work. But now here is Abraham. Now stay with me, because here he follows the lineage. Abraham, who is the father of the whole family of Jacob, whose son was Levi, and now you have Levi through the loin of Abraham, by the seed of Abraham, paying tithes to Melchizedek. So what the author is saying here is that the Levites, who usually receive tithes by law, they actually paid tithes to Melchizedek through Father Abraham. And he mentions the fact that who gets a blessing, the greater or the lesser? The greater always blesses the lesser. Who's the lesser? Abraham. Who's the lesser? Levites. Which is the greatest? The priesthood of Melchizedek. Which is the greatest? The priesthood of Christ. The priesthood of Christ. That's the point the author's trying to make. The priesthood of Christ is by divine appointment, not by lineage. It wasn't because he was from the tribe of Levi, because he wasn't. Neither was Melchizedek. His lineage superseded that of even the tribe of Levi, who paid tribute to Melchizedek through their father Abraham. Now, I don't know. I may have just confused you royally. I hope I didn't. To me, it's clear as a bell. but trying to get it across may have been a little muddy. But the main thing that we want to realize is that the writer of Hebrews chapter 7 is making a comparison of three priesthoods. Well, actually two. The priesthood of the Levites and the priesthood of Melchizedek, and then comparing Jesus to the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is the greatest of all. That's all he's trying to say. All of this other was to prove his point of which was the greatest. I would encourage you to study it. You know, we talked about this morning that in the Hebrew letter, the writer said that he was going to discuss things that were first principle because they weren't yet ready for the meat of the Word. But then later he begins talking about the priesthood of Christ. That's when he gets to the meat of the Word. This morning we talked about the milk, the first principle, the building block, the foundation stone of the church. Tonight we have looked at one of the deep, beautiful subjects of both Old and New Testaments. In comparing the priesthood of Christ with that of Melchizedek. Go home and read it. Study it. Because I really feel it's important that we get a good grasp of what the writer's saying. Because we miss so much. I'm telling you, I've missed a lot all the years until finally I did a good research on the Hebrews 7. And it thrilled me. And you know, one of the things about being a preacher, you get to studying something, and all of a sudden, a light turns on, and you want to share it. That's what this was tonight. The light came on, and I had to share it. Because this is awesome. Anytime we can talk about Christ and His work on this earth and His work now, it's truly a great thing. Tonight, we are blessed to have a high priest, the order of Melchizedek. We are blessed to have one who is our high priest, who feels our struggles and pains, has been through the very thing that we have gone through, and can intercede for us. I'm so thankful that we have Jesus as our high priest. I'm thankful that we have Jesus Christ as our Savior. Tonight, is He your Savior? Have you did what we talked about this morning, put Him on in baptism? Have you repented of your sins? Have you confessed your faith? If you haven't, then you're not where you ought to be with Christ. As many as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. In Christ is all the spiritual blessings. Christian, are you living your life in such a way that you're glorifying Him with your life, with your attitude, with your behavior? If we can help you with any decision you have to make tonight, we'd encourage you to come as we stand and sing together.